Well, welcome. I appreciate y'all attending this afternoon. So my name is Trey. I'm your presenter for this evening or afternoon. And Sarah is my colleague. She will be managing the chats for us.
Hello, everyone.
And you have joined us for Obituaries, Society Columns, and News. In other words, how to locate news newspapers to find your family. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So the class objectives, we're going to give a brief introduction on what might be available in newspapers to find, and some of the skills we hope you'll learn and get out of the program, some basic tips on how to research newspaper resources. Hopefully you'll be able to identify where to find some newspapers. And you'll discover various online resources, various online tools that you can use to find newspapers. So that's kind of the long and short of what we'll be covering today. So what might be available in the newspaper? If some of you are of a certain age that grew up with newspapers and had family that read newspapers, might have actually actively posted birth announcements or marriage announcements. Nobody's really going to post a divorce notice, but they would appear in legal notices or something like that, or an obituary for a passing of a family member. Then you're familiar. In newspapers, you might also find court information, court announcements, legals, if you will, the legal announcements, or official county or city or town proceedings. Newspapers were frequently some newspapers would be designated in a community to be the public journal for a particular town, county, or parish or something like that. And all that means is they are where the official postings, the official announcements for a governmental body would post their information. You might also find social events, find information about upcoming weddings, even birthdays or anniversary announcements. So a significant birthday celebration, family may put something in for someone celebrating their first birthday, or someone celebrating their 100th birthday. You might find that across a lot of segments of the community with people posting that, or especially if there was a member of the community that was prominent, that their birthdays or anniversaries may be posted as a course of honor because they are a founding member of something, some historic event within a community. And advertisements. Don't discount advertisements, large and small. So it may be a display advertisement. Perhaps you had an ancestor that owned a business that would advertise. You might glean some interesting details out of those advertisements, or even small classified ads. They may have their name in the community, who to call John Smith at extension 45. Back in the day with a very small communities, and your phone numbers were two to three digits. So you might find some interesting things there. And also school events. I know a lot of things that come to mind might be the sports pages, you know, what was happening with the teams, the high school or the college, or maybe it was the Little League teams, Little League baseball teams or something in the community. Those are published certainly, but also, especially in the smaller communities, smaller daily or weekly newspapers serving a community outside of a larger metropolitan area, there'd be some enterprising teachers that might have written a little write-up about a particular interesting lesson or an activity that their class happens to be doing. Sometimes it was orchestrated through the schools as a media contact, or a lot of times, like I said, in a very small community, individual teachers would take it upon themselves to send to the newspaper interesting events, a particular interesting lesson that led to a field trip, or social studies fair or science fair type stuff. All of those might get posted. Of course, may have been, if you had good enough grades, you may have been posted in the honor roll. The schools would post honor rolls and publish those in the newspaper. So you get little interesting tidbits and different possible entry points through the school events in a newspaper. If the community was a commercial or passenger port, you might have interesting articles regarding ship arrivals and departures, important moments within a community's economy or social life would be detailed in the newspapers. And of course, the general news and history of a community would certainly be published within the newspapers. There's also social columns, society columns. And the social and society columns, they could be anything from a large celebration of an important family or an important business, important politicians doing things within the community, or just as simple as, especially in the really small communities, and the further back you go, you'll see more of them. Earlier in the history, especially with travel being much more difficult if you had to do it by horse and buggy, horse and wagon, it took time. But you'll find maybe small mentions in newspaper where a member of the community actually went and visited her daughter, or visited a sister, or went to visit a relative, or even just a friend, childhood friend, and they would travel maybe to the next county. Or if it's a really big trip, they'd have a little bit more write-up and might travel out of state, or they travel from Texas to Chicago to visit their great aunt for her 80th birthday or something. Those interesting little tidbits would be published within a newspaper. And I just wanted to note that, a lot of times newspapers may disappear at times or go completely out of business, and especially during times of war, disease pandemics, kind of like the times we find ourselves currently. And as an example, just to illustrate that, even in current times, the Plano Star-Courier did not publish for quite a number of weeks due to office and building closures, when the shutdown for the state due to the COVID-19. And then when they did return to publication, they were only publishing on Sundays. So different things can impact publications over time. Natural disasters, hurricanes, obviously, and tornadoes. So we have a poll question for y'all. We want to get some of y'all's feedback, and want to know, have you personally ever been mentioned in a newspaper before? Yes or no, or maybe you don't know. We'll give y'all some time to respond here. Yeah, some people are deciding. All right, so looks like about 70% of you responded that yes, you've been personally mentioned in a newspaper article. 12% of you have said no, and about 20% of you don't know. Well, that's cool. All right. Very cool. So, I'm sorry, did I just undo your share? Sorry about that. All right, so we're gonna clear that out. Thank y'all. Let me make sure this move over. So we're gonna talk about some basic research tips. So how to research. So these are a few of the basic questions to ask yourself before you start. Hopefully like we've mentioned, if you've taken our Genealogy 101, you've filled out your ancestral chart or your family record documentation, and you've got all your notes, everything is readily at hand. So you want to gather all your research, your notes, and decide, what do you want to find? In other words, who are you looking for? Where are you looking for it? And hopefully you have an idea of when you're looking for it. Then you would ask, determine what newspapers would help you discover possible family information. And then consider where do you find those newspapers? And we'll talk a little more about this in a few moments, but that's a question you need to ask. Let's say you've already undertook a little bit of your search for newspapers. You've already started your research and you actually start looking through the newspaper resources. One thing to remember, do not forget to cite your sources. It's very important to make notes of the publication title, the volume and issue numbers, the date of publication, and the page numbers. Really important to make your notes for everything that you find. You need to document that. In your post-research evaluations or your personal reflections, once you've maybe found some stuff, hopefully, ask yourself, two very important questions. How did this help you? And where do I go from here? So hopefully you found some information. Did that help? Maybe you didn't quite find something. Maybe you found something else intriguing, or maybe not, but you have some ideas. You found some other little threads. Where do you go from here? That'll help kind of guide some of your thought processes of what to look for. Maybe you start a new search afresh, kind of referring back to your basic questions like who you're looking for, where. Maybe you need to revise those and you go back into those and look. I will note here that newspapers can be primary and secondary resources of information. And one of the things you must critically evaluate is you've got to evaluate each article to determine, is it a primary resource, or is it a secondary resource? Because generally newspapers are a great source of primary historical information about a community and what was written about events at the time they were happening or shortly afterwards. So you kind of look at that, a primary and secondary source. So a secondary source, let's say something written in 1920 and about an event published in 1920, that's going to be your primary history resource. If it's 2020 and it's referring back to something that happened in 1920 and it's referring back to what's been found and what's been researched, well, those are going to be your secondary resources. So you kind of have to look at the time period, what's it talking about, and things like that to determine your primary or secondary resource. So identifying and finding your newspapers. So I'm going to pause here and talk about a few things here. Because one of the first very important steps in finding your newspapers and finding the newspapers that you're looking to find that might have information is to identify what publications existed for that given time period and the names of those publications. Because you'd be surprised how many small communities and large, how many different newspapers they had. The further back you go, it's quite surprising how many newspapers a community could support. Today we think of, what comes to mind for Dallas is the Dallas Morning News, right? So, but further back you go in time, there may have been 6 or 8 newspapers serving Dallas. I'm not that familiar with the Dallas history, but I know from newspaper history, I know there had been others that had been here. Names escape me at the moment, but further back you go, you might be surprised at how many different publications. Over time, many of these newspapers were bought by other existing publications, and then their collection of their library, their reference library, of their newspaper collections got merged into a existing entity. Maybe they created a completely new entity with a different name or a merged name. One thing to consider is many newspapers, they were either a weekly or a daily in publication. That's your two primary. There are exceptions, but typically you're looking at either a weekly, publishing once a week or once a day. And there were morning, especially in the larger areas, the larger towns or the larger metropolitan cities, there were morning and there were afternoon or evening newspaper publications. Historically, the afternoon and evening newspapers did not survive in business. You kind of think about it, it was kind of American popular tradition. You got up in the morning, you had your cup of coffee, and you read the newspaper. And traditionally, morning newspapers had the larger circulation. By the afternoon or early evening, when those newspapers came out, that kind of warm, fuzzy American tradition of sitting with a cup of coffee and a newspaper weren't really as much of a thing. Your working day was done. You were decompressing from the day, lack of a better term, and going about your personal life, and didn't really read the paper in the evening quite so much. So those evening circulations frequently were lower. So in finding the newspapers, here's some things to consider. Kind of make some mental list as you're searching. Is, consider the town where your ancestor lived. Depending on where they may have lived, if they lived in a very rural area, you may, and the community did not have a newspaper that you could find, maybe consider broadening your search and consider looking at neighboring towns who may have had a newspaper. Sometimes neighboring towns or cities would have information covering a little bit larger area than just their immediate town. They covered a larger area of a county. Kind of the same to that with the county or the region. In a very rural area, which I could imagine West Texas, very rural, very limited numbers in population, that maybe a small community didn't have quite enough business and individuals to sustain a newspaper. So there may have been a newspaper that covered all the communities within an entire county, or maybe within an entire region. And even in more populated areas, there still was region or multi-county publications, obviously. Dallas paper obviously carries news from all over Texas and all over North Texas region, obviously, today. So consider all the different towns where your relatives may have lived as they traveled. We'll get into a little bit more of this too later. Consider any ethnic communities that your ancestors may have been a part of, especially if they were an immigrant, early immigrant to the country, or not an early immigrant, but a recent immigrant to the country. Let's say your ancestors were from Romania, and there is a Romanian, significant Romanian immigrant community in the region. They may have had a newspaper that covered their community, and it might have also been in their language. It may have been in Romanian, or there may be a Polish community, or may have been an Italian community or a German community. Texas had a couple of German colonies, so you had newspapers serving those communities that may have been in German. And the same goes for any religious affiliations. You may have smaller newspapers that served specific, very small communities. World of stuff out there. So in identifying and finding newspapers, a very important thing to consider is not every issue is online. We wish there was a great one-stop shop for newspapers that held exactly the publications you needed, that covered the exact dates you needed, and represent complete collections with no missing issues. Wish that was the case. Unfortunately, with newspaper research, there's no utopian research database for newspaper that has everything you wish. It just doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist, or else we wouldn't be here today talking about it, right? So in trying to identify what newspapers were in a community and what their names might have been, what the publication names may have been, you can check with any local libraries to see what newspapers were available in their communities. Local libraries are a good source, either public or if there's a university or college, check with them. You can check the newspapers of the nearby areas, like I had already mentioned, adjacent communities where your ancestors had lived. And another thing I can say about that is, especially depending on how far back you go, there was the cases of, counties or parishes were much larger than they are today, and a large county or large parish got chopped up into additional counties, right? So you may have had the newspaper office, let's just say, for example, not saying this is true, just a ballpark example. Let's say you had the newspaper headquarters in Denton, Texas, and you lived in North Dallas somewhere. They may have, at one time, the land area was a much larger, whether when it was the colony or then the larger county, and then those got chopped up. So some mention of your relatives that happened somewhere else very distant away today was still within that coverage area. So you might want to look at some of those nearby areas, and it helps them know some of the history of the counties or parishes, and kind of get an idea of, okay, if these got chopped up, where might some of those records be? Just like you would look for any other genealogy official records, legal notices and things like that. And as people move from community to community across state lines, check, see if you can research and find what the publications were in those different areas if they lived there for some time in all the different regions. And just don't stick with the date that you think you have. Think forward and backwards in time, and I mean that as far as the publication date. Those things didn't get instantly printed in newspapers like an Instagram post or a tweet today, right? There was some time for something to be written and something to get set and type and go to press, and sometimes that was overnight for a bigger community with a big staff. Sometimes that would have been a lead time of several days, or maybe it was next week's paper that it came out. So, or the week after. So just kind of keep that in mind. And again, please cite your article sources, publication title, volume, issue, date, and pages. Very important. Before we jump over into online resources and talk about some of our varied resources and where you can find stuff, are there any questions so far? I know I've breezed through a big 10,000 foot view of some things.
No questions so far. One of our attendees did mention the Dallas Times Herald as one of the old Dallas newspapers that we've had. And then somebody else mentioned the Hermann Volksblätter is a German newspaper in Hermann, Missouri. So that's a really good example, like you were talking of the different foreign language or community newspapers. I know here in the Dallas area, since we have a large Asian population, we do have a lot of Chinese newspapers and things like that as well.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a very good point. And I'll jump in here too, because I just thought of it when I was talking about the mergers and how papers get bought and sold or go out of business. And you may know this, and you may have seen it and never you may have read articles in recent times in your times to know about this, but you know, when the papers merge, you know, we see a lot of this, Herald Gazette or Times Gazette or News Times, or these hyphenated words. To me, I come out of a newspaper background myself. I guess I should have said that up front. Small community newspaper. And what that tells me from my history and what I know is that those hyphenated names gives you a clue that those may have been two different entities at one time. There may have been an Anytown Times and an Anytown Gazette that at some point in history, one went out of business or was bought out by the other, and then they merged to be the Times Gazette. That's kind of maybe a slight oversimplification, but it kind of gives you a clue that at one time they were two separate entities in a community. So that might help in search and looking for names. So just kind of keep that in mind.
Okay, we did have a couple of questions come through. I think a couple will be some quick answers. The first was, were adoption notices published back in early 1900s? I think the short answer to that one is we don't know exactly, possibly. We would have to do more research on that.
Yeah, it would probably be wholly dependent upon that local state government or what region and what time. And I'm sorry, I'm not well versed in that. I don't know.
The second question was, how can one translate a foreign language newspaper? My best suggestion would be to use Google Translate or another online translation service like that. Those aren't going to be 100% accurate, but you can at least get an idea of what some of those are saying. Or
exactly.
Find some people online you could hire to do the translations for you.
Exactly. And as we get into some of these online resources, I don't know because I haven't looked at some of the foreign language newspapers that they'll have. They may have a translation feature where
right.
you can select that.
And
translate those.
Yeah, the last question we got is, where would you suggest researching for African-American people from like Arkansas or Louisiana? So I think about the resources that Trey is about to get into are.
Yeah, let's save that. Try to remind me
answer that question. Yeah, and if we haven't answered your question by the end, just let us know again, and we can try and get into more detail for that.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to step in on you. You cut out there for a minute, so I thought you had paused. My bad. Yeah, we'll talk about some of that because I got a point where I'll talk about, yes, that very point. I have it in a little bit. So we'll go on and blaze on with some of this. So the online resources. So we've got a number of resources that we're talking about this afternoon. Many of these are free, but we have some little dollar signs next to some of these. Many of them are paid subscription, paid membership access resources. Now, on some of them, like we have on this list with the dollar sign next to, such as Ancestry and Fold3, those have a free access point. If you have a Plano Public Library card, we have those in our database resources with the Plano Public Library. So you can access the library edition of Ancestry through the library. And just a little side note, we hope maybe in the future, we're talking with those Ancestry.com folks. Hopefully we can offer remote access, but currently it's available only within the library. The Fold3, which is also an Ancestry product, dealing with the military records, you can access remotely. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments as we just go ahead and segue and launch into these. And I'm just going to kind of give you an overall 10,000 foot view of what some of these resources are, maybe what some of the extent of their collections, and some comments along the way is what we're doing. We're not going to get into any really in-depth searching with these at the moment. Some are better than others, and hopefully I'll catch those and I'll mention those as we go through. So one of the first ones I'm going to talk about, which is a free resource, is Chronicling America, which is put on as a collaboration between the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. It's a wonderful resource, Chronicling America, and it is a long-term effort to provide searchable database of historic U.S. newspapers on the web. And they try to provide these select digitized pages, and they have access to info and historic U.S. papers from 1789 through 1963. And they also have a newspaper title directory, which might be very useful in trying to locate what titles might have been in publication within a given community or state or a larger region. So that might be helpful. And the Library of Congress considers the Chronicling America newspapers to be public domain. So yes, this is free accessible. They have the examples on the screenshot have fairly clear looking images for their newspapers there. And it's a wonderful worth exploring. And they've got a number of tools and recommended topics and how to use website. It's pretty neat. Although up in this, I don't know if you can see it, in this one button here on that screenshot shows U.S. Newspaper Directory 1690 to present. So 1690 to present has U.S. newspapers apparently. Another one that some of you might be familiar with, if you've ever requested an interlibrary loan book title, we use libraries, public libraries around the state, around the country and world use Worldcat. And this allows you to search library catalogs from around the state and in fact around the world. And Worldcat claims to be the largest library catalog in the world. But generally, it gives you a chance to search participating library catalogs from around the state and around the world, as I had mentioned. And it's really especially useful in trying to find newspapers that are held by public or academic libraries. So you're having a tough time locating where a title might be. You might be able to locate it in Worldcat and find out who has it in a collection, and then explore whether they have online access that's open to the public or how you could access it. And I'll note here that if you locate something and you're having difficulty trying to source how you can get it, please talk to us at the Genealogy Center here at the Plano Public Library so that we can find out if an interlibrary loan is possible. We have working relationships with a lot of different institutions where through the Genealogy Center, we're able to get sometimes microfilm in as interlibrary loan that you could view and scan on our microform readers that we have at the library. Unfortunately, they're currently not available to the public because we're still generally closed to the public, except for the computer reservation appointments. But hopefully soon, depending on what happens in the world. I just will note that you also possibly have the option, you might could get photocopies, request photocopies. We've done that before. So whether you're requesting, and we can get a microfilm reel borrowed or photocopies, it's going to cost $2.50 per ILL, which is not a bad fee to be able to get something that you haven't been able to locate before. So I'm talking about the Genealogy Center. We have a lot of resources available through the Plano Public Library's Genealogy Center. And a lot of them pertain to newspapers, yes. We even have a link to the Chronicling America, the Historic American Newspapers, Library of Congress. But we also have some cool stuff like the name index by year for the Plano Star Courier. And you can see we have some pretty early dates, 1918, 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23. We have the Plano Star Courier name index, June 2003 through December 2013. And we also have links to some of our surrounding institutions, such as the McKinney Public Library that also has a newspaper collection with birth, engagement, marriage, and obituary resources available as well. And I will mention too that for our microfilm collection, we hold a pretty good collection of local and Collin County newspapers on microfilm. So we have the Plano Star Courier, the Weekly Democrat Gazette, which was a McKinney newspaper, the Plano Post, McKinney Courier Gazette, Sherman Daily Register, and the Dallas Herald, both the weekly and the daily, and a few others. Those you can search our library catalog online, and they will be records that you can discover there. And if any other questions, you can give us a call. We also have one of the research databases through our library resources at the Genealogy Center is the Ancestry.com. It does have an individual membership subscription, but as I mentioned, we have access to the library edition available at the library. And this is a for-profit company. It's owned by an investor group, and it's not affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It just happens to be based in Utah. Coincidence. But they carry newspapers, U.S. and international newspapers in their collections. So an example here, the search interface, if you're already familiar with doing some of your genealogy research with Ancestry, you're going to be familiar with how they have it set up where you can search the newspapers as well. So a lot of the same search usability interface, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And then at this screenshot, I don't know if y'all can see it well off here to the right, it has a U.S. obituary collection, 1930 to current. And it even has the times from London, Chicago Daily Herald. And if you're interested in maybe researching some of your ancestors' military service, if it was between 1942 and 1964, it shows here in a feature data collection, a Stars and Stripes newspaper from the Europe, Mediterranean, and North African editions. So those might be really cool and really useful. Again, I had mentioned the Fold3. That's another one of our databases that we offer through the Genealogy Center. Fold3 is also an Ancestry.com product. This is primarily, if y'all attended the Scouting the Military Records, you'll know that this is one of the databases you typically be exploring your ancestors' military, U.S. military service, whichever branch. However, they do have some digital collections that include historic newspapers from the 1700s through the 1900s. And you can access Fold3 with your library card from home, so you don't have to come into the library for this. And it is keyword searchable. They don't have an extensive library within this collection of newspapers, and it can be fiddly a little bit to find. But if you go under the category, you can browse you have to go under the non-military records. And then on the publication type, you can select newspapers. And it'll give you a list of publications off to the side, always opening up a new set to the right. So that's another interesting area to explore. Also, always consider communicating or going to their website any genealogical or historical societies, they may have either complete editions or they may have scrapbooks, newspaper clippings of historic events or important things pertaining to their community, whatever their mission is, that might have good resources. I start here and give the example of the Texas State Genealogical Society here as an example of what a larger organization in a state would be. However, I wasn't really able, and going through their site, I really wasn't able to identify that they had a specific collection of newspaper resources listed on their site. I'm giving this as an example because I just felt bad about leading with this one. Another state, the Oklahoma Historical Society does have a newspaper archives in their collection, which is really cool. And these are just examples that there are many such organizations on the national, regional, county, or local levels scattered all over the country that might have a varying degree of resources in their collections. So with American Ancestors, this is a really interesting collection that I would like to explore and play with. American Ancestors is by the New England Historical Genealogical Society. And this society was founded in 1845. So they have a long history. It is a paid membership based nonprofit organization, but they do provide a pretty impressive range of education services and original research and family histories, but they do maintain special collections, including newspaper collections, so a 19th century newspaper database, along with family histories and photographs, of course. And they offer loads of webinars and subject guides. Not that I'm sounding like an advertisement for any of these. I'm just trying to identify resources that might be of interest. Other resources like the the Portal to Texas History is a really cool resource. I don't know how many of you have explored this, and it's worth the exploration. This is freely available. This is hosted by the University of North Texas, and they are really known, amongst other things. They're working on a big side project, which is the Texas Digital Newspaper Program. And this is a partnership with communities, institutions, and publishers from around the state. And their goal is to make Texas newspapers freely accessible online. And because they do the OCR, the optical character recognition scans, they are fully word searchable. So you can search by dates or names. And just as a side note too, if you're doing your Oklahoma research, let's say, and you stumble across the Oklahoma Historical Society's Gateway to Oklahoma History, and you notice, that looks familiar. Well, University of North Texas also hosts the Gateway to Oklahoma History for the Oklahoma Historical Society, and they do all have newspapers in their collections as well. So it has they built it on the same platform that they did the Portal to Texas History. So a lot of the searchability and the navigation should be very, very familiar. Good resources. Now, I'm going to talk, and I'm sorry if I butcher the name. The Dolph Briscoe Center for American History is at the University of Texas at Austin. And this is a very large newspaper collection. Excuse me. They actually claim it's the largest newspaper collection of its kind in Texas, and I have no reason to dispute that fact. In fact, they have over 4,500 titles from around Texas, southern states, U.S., and non-U.S. newspapers. They also are the home to newspaper clipping morgues of the New York Herald Tribune, the New York Journal American, the New York Times, and Newsweek magazine. Now, they do include some specialty collections, such as the Natchez Trace collection of newspapers. Unfortunately, those are not digitized. And the Gannett newspaper collection. which also unfortunately is not digitized. But the Gannett newspaper collection is a collection of newspapers, both U.S. and non-U.S. publications that cover significant U.S. or world events. So it's basically their collection of exchange newspapers from around the country and from around the world that were covering events, same as Gannett newspapers were covering. So it's a pretty neat resource. It's just unfortunate it's not digitized at the moment. And it's been a while since I've really done a deep dive with the Briscoe Center for American History and their newspapers. And I will say it is not easy to navigate this site and to search online and find any kind of online digitized collection holdings. So I'm just going to give that caveat that it's huge collection, impressive collection, but it might be a more advanced resource that requires a possible visit to the center in Austin in person to go through microfilm up close and in person, unfortunately. So I apologize if anybody dealing with this. It's not easy to navigate online. So I'm gonna chalk it up to an advanced research resource. Okay, Genealogy Bank. Genealogy Bank is a product of the Newsbank company, and it is a subscription required, individual subscription required for this. They carry newspapers from 1690 through today, and they claim to have over 13,000 big city and small town newspapers. And they cover, they cover newspapers from all 50 states. Now, note here, I haven't said anything about this earlier, but since they note that they carry big city and small town newspapers, I'll note here that, and you may have already run into this, that frequently when you maybe go to one of those large newspaper databases that are through the library, and I'm going to call them pedestrian, not specially like these we're talking about necessarily. You're going through those collections at your public library. A lot of times those only aggregate and index larger community newspapers, the larger metropolitan newspapers, the Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, smaller state. I mean, they might get the New Orleans, the Times-Picayune, they might get the Shreveport Times, maybe Baton Rouge paper, definitely. They might get Alexandria, they might get Monroe, but they won't generally get those publications scattered throughout the rest of the state of the smaller communities, even if they're adjoining a large metropolitan area. So when a database like this, actually says we're collecting small town newspapers, that's pretty cool, because those frequently were bypassed in a lot of the big newspaper databases that you normally would have access to. So that's kind of cool. They do list here that they have 95% of the newspapers are exclusive to Genealogy Bank. So pretty neat, I would think. And when I did the screenshot, I was able to pull up and find they had a list of 608 newspapers in Texas over different times. And this was alphabetical listing, and it started with Abilene. And so they have Abilene Reporter News. I don't know if I can see the screen so well. 2003 to current, and it's in the Obituaries collection. They'll have little notes out to the side. Let's see, there's Amarillo Daily News. It's from 1911 through 1922. So the collections and what they hold are going to vary, but still very neat resource with larger city and smaller town newspapers. So the newspapers.com is also another Ancestry.com product. This is also a subscription required for this, and their claim to fame is they claim to have over 300 years of U.S. and world newspapers. They too list that they hold small town and large city newspapers in their holdings. In fact, they claim over 16,700 plus newspapers from the 1700s through the 2000s, with millions of pages added every month. I note here, and I only note this not because it's an endorsement, but a lot of times these places will have a free trial period, and Newspapers.com has a 7-day free trial period. So you might want to check it out. I did note that their subscription they have different subscription levels, different tiers. And the basic level includes clipping and sharing. So you could find the newspaper and clip the article, and you could share the article with the basic level membership. Excuse me. An advanced subscription provides access to an additional 415 million plus pages. That's pretty impressive premium level. And also because there are OCR page images, it allows searching for text. So you can search by date, name, so forth. And here's an example. In searching in Texas, I went to the city of Shiner. You have the Shiner Gazette, and actually you have some very early editions of the Shiner Gazette. So the earliest is 1894. I went to May. They have actually 3 issues for the month of May in 1894, and then you can see the images continue off for each of the pages off to the right there. It just opens up continually to the right. So pretty interesting stuff. Newspaper Archive. This is also a subscription, tongue twister on subscription. Subscription required database. They cover newspapers 1607 to present. They have over 108 million something obituaries that they claim. Over 15,000, almost 16,000 current and historic newspaper titles. And they list that they have over 9 billion names in their database. I'll say that again, 9 billion. And it also covers collections from covering all 50 states and 32 international countries. And as an example here, they actually have the McKinney Courier Gazette. The collections they hold from 1910 to 1977. And what's interesting that I noted here was kind of a neat little graphic representation, a little bar graph above the images of the newspaper. When you're searching, it presents you a little bar graph here. And you can see a physical representation of how many newspapers, how many copies are in their holdings by a little graphical representation. So you can see they got a little small mark in 1910, 1913, 1917. So they got some gaps in the years. They skipped to 1947. So their holdings are largely late 68 through 69 and into 1970 is the biggest holding set. And then again in 75 and early 76. So there are gaps. You're always going to find gaps in holdings like this. You have to go to multiple sources. But I just thought that was an interesting graphical representation of their collection holding. It was kind of cool. Now, the US GenWeb, or specifically the US GenWeb project, is a free access resource. It is a database that's run by volunteers. So it's really a collection of resources that have been collected by historical or genealogical societies, groups or individuals. And you might be able to discover the names of other publications that existed at different periods of history. Now you have the access points of being able to click on each of the states, and then you can click on each of the counties or parishes to drill down. And because it's volunteer run, you never really know what breadth and depth of information you're going to find. Some regions are well represented with resources that are free. Some areas, not so much. Unfortunately, it depends if there's someone in that area that has an interest, living in the area that has an interest, that takes over one of the counties and helps stock the database with material or not. But I looked up newspapers from Lincoln Parish and surrounding areas in Louisiana, had family from the region. And like I said, I was from a newspaper background, and I knew of many of these titles of these publications, but I discovered from this website a lot of publications that I did not know existed. And this speaks to that question of how do you discover or find African-American research. I didn't know some of these ethnic community newspapers, the African-American newspapers, had the Colored Globe that published weekly from 1904 to 1905, if y'all can see further down the list on this example. The New Era published from 1904 to 1908. The Gramblinite I knew as not as an individual standalone weekly, but I knew it. I think that's now the university newspaper of the Grambling State University. I may be wrong there. I didn't go look that up. I forgot. But it published from 1936 to 1973. And again, you have the Monroe Free Press that began publication in 1969 and continues to publish today, which I did not know. I did not know they were still in publication. I knew they had been once upon a time. So you might discover through US Gen Web something like this. And you got notes and comments off to the side, off to the right, and it's like some interesting ones that might help you locate them. So up there, the number 3 down the list, the Progressive Age was a weekly newspaper from 1890 through 1916, and it has a note that that's held on microfilm at Louisiana State University. So might have some clues to be able to locate, some hard to locate, I'm going to call them obscure publications. So interesting stuff. And finally, we're talking about Family Search. Family Search does have newspapers in their collection. It's a nonprofit family history organization that's a service provided by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They have historical record collections from 655 AD until today. That's not to say that you're going to find a newspaper from 700 AD by any stretch of the imagination. That's just what they post of their overall record collection and over 4 billion names from worldwide. It's sometimes can be a challenge to suss out the newspapers out of their collection. But they have a lot of the information is digitized across the states and counties and even countries. So it is, some of you may be familiar with doing some of the other genealogical research, but you might be able to find some clippings through Family Search. It can be fiddly, admittedly. But are there any questions I could answer?
We did have a question about how to search for Native American, I guess, newspapers or records as well. For that, I would probably recommend speaking to there are tribal libraries on the reservations.
Yes, and I did.
Newspapers around there.
And I did. I can't remember. I don't see it in my notes. I did run across some note allied to that, but that might be the best, is to check with some of the nations to see if they have that's one of the things you may have to contact any of the historical or genealogical societies for a nation, or the libraries, tribal archives perhaps, or there may be a museum attached. You may have to go at it that way and see what might exist. Some of those may exist in these databases, but if you don't know what title publication title you're looking for, I can see where that might be a problem trying to find it. So you may have to kind of go at it sideways. And like I was telling in the beginning tips of, you got to kind of know what the titles publications were before you can really start then searching who has them. Because otherwise it would really be a blindfold, throw a dart at a wall to try to find some of those publications.
Yeah, one of our attendees just mentioned the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma has published the Bishkinnick newspaper, I hope I said that right, for decades. There are lots of obituaries and other items like weddings, graduations are listed. So thank you for that. That's a great example of one of them. Yeah, if you know what tribe you're trying to look for, I can spell that for y'all. It is Bishkinnik. So knowing that there are papers like that, you just might have to reach out to the other nations or things like that, whoever you're trying to look for. If you know where they were, you can try and see if there are similar papers in those. I did see a lot of people saying that they hadn't gotten the handout. So if you hadn't gotten the handout with the email before the class, we will send it out again with the recording of this presentation, and all of the links that I provided in the chat will be included in that as well.
Yes, exactly. And like I had mentioned at the beginning, give us about a week or so to get the recording pulled together. It goes through editing and closed caption and all that, and all of the participants will get email with the link to the recorded presentation and the handout link. Any other questions?
I think we've answered all the other questions. I answered some in the chats. Anybody else have anything else we haven't touched upon or answered? All right, I think that is all the questions we've had.
All right, well, thank everybody for attending this afternoon. Really appreciate it.